Hey everybody, Hooch here. I had a couple quick vids I wanted to watch before I jump back into the stream. First one up is a video by Josh Strife about why MMOs are bad for new players. So this is somebody who I believe comes with a lot of authority on the topic of MMOs. He not only has played a lot of total hours on MMOs, but he has an ongoing series where he is basically just playing every MMO out there that he can get his hands on. Uh, and you can see actually on the bottom here, it's the worst MMO ever is the name of the series. So again, this is a guy who I think has a lot of authority, and I would tend to listen to because he's certainly played more MMOs than I have. And so I'm curious to see what his impressions are on like why MMOs are bad for new players, because like any games, but certainly the sort of old school live service of an MMO, whether it be free to play or subscription, is that new player is so vital. That new player experience is so vital because once you start putting in time, you start to kind of bond with the character, with the world, you're far more likely to continue playing.
Well, I've got
So it looks like we're in RuneScape
my
here.
revolution bar over here. I suppose I could always move the revolution bar like there. Nope, that's behind me. There. I'll put it there because it's clearly so bloody important. And as you fight, so what revolution does is quite interesting. You know how you've got all these abilities that you can use and stuff? Well, instead of needing to press every single one every time you attack, you can put them on a revolution bar, and what it will do is it will use every ability as it becomes available. And so you don't really need to plan what you're doing. You just set up the revolution bar and then fight, and you don't need to know what your abilities do.
So I'm a complete novice at RuneScape. I never really played it. Watched some friends play it, but I didn't really know what was going on. But it's actually surprising for me to see the revolution bar. Maybe it's more so because I played more Western MMOs. But the reason you don't see these in a lot of games is first and foremost to combat botting. If you have the ability to just, it's almost like an auto fight button, right? I mean, yes, you've got to customize the abilities in which they're used, the order in which they're used. But for example, WoW doesn't have this because it would make it much harder to distinguish between a real player and a bot. Now we can laugh, of course, about Blizzard's ability or inability to really combat botting in the first place, and they've used bots as an excuse to sort of throw up their hands and say, "Well, we're not really going to fight this. We're just going to introduce the WoW token." But putting that aside for a moment, were they still kind of fighting the good fight? If you're going to let people chain together abilities and basically just one button kill mobs, that's going to look a lot like a bot.
Now, just let me explain this and tell me what you think about this. This is the first boss encounter we've been given. We have been given a revolution bar with 4 abilities on it. Lesser Dismember.
So it sounds like when he says given, it sounds like this is auto-generated.
Slice the target, causing them to bleed. We have not had bleed damage explained to us.
Okay.
Slice, base.
I mean, you see that and you're like, duh, it does damage over time. But you probably know that because you've played MMOs that had bleed. So nobody has that innate knowledge necessarily. You have to make a guess, but that's not what a game is supposed to do. You're not supposed to guess at what your abilities do. They're supposed to tell you what they do so you can learn how to chain them or maximize them or use them efficiently together in sort of a combo. But yeah, I mean, if you don't know what bleed does from a previous MMO, then you have no reason to know what it does. If the target is
bound or stunned, damage increased by 40%. We have not had anything about binding or stunning explained to us, and yet this is relevant to it.
Okay.
Lesser Sever. Strike at the target's vitals and do lots of damage.
Like a high damage.
That's fair. Totally understandable, basic stuff. Backhand. Strike the target with the back of your hand. 20 to 100% damage and stun the...
So you would want this before the second ability, right? Because it does more damage to stunned. So if this is auto-generated and maybe... it seemed, based on how he phrased it, it was auto-generated. This is another reason to either not have something like this in the game or not auto-generate it, because if you're going to auto-generate something that people are going to use for combat in a game that's largely combat, you have to be really on point with it. So it's a reason not to have it, because you're going to have people dedicated to just the auto-generation of abilities, and as abilities change, they get nerfed or improved, or new abilities are dropped that have synergies with old abilities. All of that is going to have to feed into this auto-generated software or code. And if it's not perfect, people are going to A, complain, and B, not use it, both of which are like terrible outcomes. So, yeah, not great.
For 1.2 seconds. So straight away, we're going to go into a fight. We've had this set up for us, and we don't yet know that we're doing bleed damage, we're stunning, and we're doing bonus damage based on stuns. That's 3 mechanics that if I click on this enemy, I'm just instantly using without any knowledge that I'm using them. This to me feels like you're giving the player a decent setup of how to play without them actually fully understanding why it's a decent setup.
I get, but I mean, is it a decent setup? Because from my understanding, the fourth ability, if used before the second ability, would cause the second ability to do more damage. Now, it feeds into his point of like, you don't know why what you're doing is good, but I don't even know that it is good. So I guess something I didn't think about that he just mentioned is if your auto-generated rotation is really good, there will come a point where the game is more complicated and where it needs to be more fine-tuned in order for you to maximize your damage, for example. And people just won't know how to do that because they've been playing the game, not necessarily on autopilot, but a certain aspect of it is actually on autopilot. So, for example, in the Diablo 4 recently released, and if you play something like the Barbarian, your core ability, it's all about weapon swapping. Long story short, though, they will decide for you which weapon you use for certain abilities. And in the beginning, it's by default, it's on auto, number one. And number two, it can probably make more sense in the beginning of the game when you're still learning. You don't even have the abilities unlocked. You don't necessarily understand the skill tree. But later in the game, there might be a very valid reason to use some weapon that is not what the computer thinks that you should be doing, what Blizzard effectively thinks you should be using. And that's totally fine because when you are in the late game, you understand your character, your build very well, and you should be given that agency. And yes, there is a way to go in and change it, but again, that's a very simple example. This is probably a much more complex example where you have entire skill bars and skill rotations, and any aspect of your gear can make that change. So yeah, you're essentially front loading or back loading the knowledge required to actually play the game to make it easier to play in the beginning, if that makes sense. Which maybe they had a realistic conversation internally, the game developers did, about like, yeah, we know that that's the case, but if we make it easier, people are more likely to play it and continue playing it. And then once they get to a point where they're willing to learn more to maximize their efficiency, damage, whatever, then they will go ahead and seek that out and do that on their own. So maybe that was an actual conversation. I have no idea.
You've also got your old ability over here of Slaughter. Stab the target, causing them to bleed, deals 3 times damage if the target moves. But that has never been explained to us either. We've been given the tooltip and told to use it when we can, but this tutorial very much feels like they've given the player a hell of a lot of cool stuff without really taking the time to explain what the cool stuff they've now got is. You don't... And if you've played lots of MMOs before, you'll totally get it. But it's very difficult. Sometimes you have to take a step back from your knowledge and say, right, Morningstar, bronze offhand mace, not using it, Morningstar's bones. Sometimes you have to take a step back from the knowledge that you've got and say, right, how would a new player know what this is? How would a new player know what to do with this?
Yeah.
All you need is an encounter with an enemy who slashes or backslaps you, and then you'll understand. Yeah.
So, and this is why it's really important for QA, or as much as possible for a developer, to put themselves in the mindset of a new player. To what percentage or to what degree is somebody truly going to be new? There's a lot of cross, I don't know, call it pollination or cross play. So somebody who plays one MMO and loves the genre, like Josh Strife, for example, he's played a lot of MMOs. He will hop around from MMOs. And so he's not, yes, he might be a new player, but bleed is almost always, if not universally, a damage over time effect. So he knows. Now, I think what he's mostly talking about are the legitimate new players, first-time MMOs who don't understand some of these universals across MMOs, and they'll learn over time. And so, yeah, I think he's right. I would just almost more of point of curiosity, to what degree are MMO players truly new? Because you're only going to be a new MMO player maybe even just once, right? You play one game, and there's going to be nuances to different MMOs, but you learn what a bleed effect is
and what it does. Let them use it. put them into a place where they have to use it, and when one mechanic is understood, move on to the next one. Yeah. It's pretty much, look at all the things the game has, now go and use them all and figure it out. That's a perfect way of putting it, Letish. Absolutely perfect way of putting it.
Okay.
The game is very proud that it has all of these things.
And that there are people who enjoy that, honestly. It might not be the best from an MMO specifically, because they tend to be a little bit more complex, if not a lot more complex than a lot of games. So you might draw a parallel and say, like, hey, the Legends of Zelda, especially the last two games that came out, Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild. Tears of the Kingdom was a bit more involved on the tutorial. I won't spoil anything, but it was a bit longer. The first one, though, is basically like, here's your abilities that you get in the game, and just sort of go out there and figure it out. But again, that was like 4 abilities and that's all you get for the entire game. In an MMO, you might end up with 20 or 30 abilities. And yeah, you might not use all of them. In fact, you probably won't. But in some games, you will. I mean, when you include things like using consumables, trinkets, rings, whatever, that kind of have abilities attached to them, it becomes infinitely more complex. So just giving somebody the sort of space to figure it out on their own, for an MMO, I think the number of people that would be interested in that shrinks compared to a Zelda game with 4 abilities and you just go and explore an open world.
But it's so proud, it forgets to take the time to truly explain what these things all actually do, and then just gives you them and kind of shoos you off to adventure. Go and have fun. Go and have fun. Devil's Advocate, that would make the tutorial too long.
That would make the tutorial too long. Maybe, but I mean, how many effects and modifiers are there really in a game for each class? There's probably not that. Yes, there's a lot of abilities, but again, it looks like he's playing a warrior, so you might have a bleed effect, a stun effect, like a silence or like a silence effect, or like an interrupt, basically. A snare effect that's like a slow. And I make maybe 1 or 2, like a shout effect or something like that. But the total number of effects are slightly less. So, like, would a tutorial need to take forever? Probably not. Number 1. Number 2, if done effectively, and I'll try to remember to drop it in the description, but I think it was Game Maker's Toolkit a couple of years ago did a video on tutorials. And to me, I'm always infinitely more interested and even kind of fascinated in games where developers make the tutorial an interesting part of the game. Like, it doesn't feel like a tutorial. It's not like one of these games where it's like, press WASD when you first sort of start into the campaign, and then it says press C to crouch, and you have to crouch over some low-hanging log or broken debris or whatever like that. I mean, that is a very basic, straightforward way, and yes, it can get you to the action more, but when you have something like an MMO, I mean, the whole game until, I mean, an argument even end game, but huge chunks of the game are still going to be tutorial or have almost mini tutorials in them, because you might hit a power spike later on. I am very much more in favor of people, it's not really sneaking in the tutorial, but building the game such that you don't even notice that you're playing a tutorial. It's almost, you wouldn't even call it the tutorial, or a player couldn't even distinguish between the tutorial and the game. Internally, they, say, okay, this was sort of the tutorial. But externally, when you're just playing the game, you don't know where the tutorial begins and ends, because it just feels like you're playing the game.
In that case, work out how to make the tutorial fun, because a good tutorial is a fun, enjoyable, playable part of the game. Soul Reaver has like a 2-hour tutorial, but it's actually the opening of the game.
Does it really?
Portal is a 1-hour tutorial.
Yeah, Portal's a really good example.
Everything you can do in the game, and then
that.
It goes off. Any good game, the tutorial is actually an early part of the game where you learn.
Sometimes you just gotta let the man talk instead of pausing the video.
Stuff. God of War 1, you're still learning stuff halfway through the game. That could still be considered part of the tutorial. The tutorial doesn't have to be a separate part of the game. It can be an opening section of the adventure that you can go on if you want to. Or you can choose, if you want to skip it.
Okay.
So
yeah, that makes sense, especially for MMOs where you tend to play a lot of, at least I've always wanted to play alts to play different classes. So yeah, the ability to skip a more basic tutorial that isn't class specific or UI specific, learning how the sort of game functions makes a lot of sense.
I mean, Breath of the Wild is just a massive tutorial until it teaches you slowly how to get things. What I'm saying is that was one boss encounter. What if that boss encounter could only be hurt by bleed damage? Suddenly you're shown how bleed works. What if a boss needs to be stunned before you can hit it? Okay, cool, now we've got stuns. And yes, it would make it a relatively long experience, but if RuneScape wants to be a complicated game, it needs to understand that it must teach players.
I mean, if you're trying to make a game that's, for example, like some certain bosses are more take more damage from fire, and so you have a damage over time fire effect that you want to apply to them, and that teaches you that aspect. Same with the bleed, like you mentioned. Like that could easily fit within the actual confines of the game itself and not feel like a tutorial, because the idea is that this is an aspect of the game. You are now just at the first boss. The first boss requires you to damage or to stun him. And during the 1.5, 2 seconds of stun, that's when you can do a lot more damage.
Players, its complexity. I think one of the things that RuneScape doesn't do very well is it does not teach players its complexity. A tutorial should never be something you dread and want to get over with. It should be a way of playing through the game, and by the time you understand all of the game, you've actually been like, oh, that whole thing was tutorialized. Fantastic. That wasn't... A great way to look at it is The Simpsons Hit and Run. Everyone played The Simpsons Hit and Run?
I have, but it's been so long.
The entire first level is a tutorial.
I don't remember.
It's teaching you how to get in the car. It's teaching you how to jump. It's teaching you how to kick. It's teaching you how to walk around. It's teaching you how to find shortcuts. It's teaching you how to call your car. It's teaching you how to avoid the police. It's teaching you how to fix your car. The entire first level of The Simpsons Hit and Run is literally every single mechanic tutorialized via a playthrough of the level. And then when you get to level 2, it's like, okay, cool, you know everything we have. Go and do it all again like 10 times. Cool. Okay. Yes. A good tutorial is when you don't even notice the moment that you know what you're doing, but you're suddenly sat there thinking...
Yeah, that's an interesting way to phrase it. There's not a moment that it clicks. I wonder how realistic that necessarily is, only because there's moments where you realize, for me, it's more of, oh, that synergizes really well with this, and I understand why. But I guess he is right, though. From a tutorial standpoint, it's not like I understand why this works, but I don't know. Maybe I'm just being a little bit too nitpicky here, but I think ultimately you're going to learn. And so it's not that you're trying to hide the learning. It's that you're trying to hide the forced learning, or that you're trying to hide the just go here, do this. This is what it does. Okay, good luck kind of thing. Instead, it's a little bit more natural. But I still think that learning feeling is still going to be there. It just feels way better. And when you learn it for yourself, or you feel like you learned it for yourself, and B, aren't just shoehorned on a track to say, go here, do this. Good, you did it. Now go here, duck under this thing. Okay, you learned duck.
I know what I'm doing. I understand every single button press. I understand my agency over every mechanic. I understand the power that I have got to lead this adventure in the way that I want it to go. And what we're seeing right now with the RuneScape opening tutorial is they give you an ability bar with abilities on it, and they say, hey, this is a good setup, but they don't explain why. And you don't... You know when you fought that troll and suddenly you were slapping it, you were stabbing it, you were slicing it, you were bleeding it? I didn't feel like I was doing any of that. I did not feel responsible for the success in that combat. I felt that I attacked them, the game did what it told me that it should do, and I won. And I feel like that was the game's victory.
But I wonder, and maybe he'll say this, but I wonder how much of that is them not explaining certain abilities and him having this tool that chains together abilities. So instead of pressing all the different buttons, as ridiculous as that may seem, but instead of pressing all the buttons, he is just pressing one button and it's sort of running through 5, 10 abilities. It looks like there's only 4 right now. But again, if you had pressed all the abilities, and that might be sort of psychology faking you out, but that would to me feel more like you did it. It's sort of like if you play a class that has a finisher move of some kind, that you have to build up stacks on an enemy of some kind, or stacks on yourself. and then you get to sort of press one button and just unload a bunch of damage. That feels better. Now, you might not have known why you're building up the stacks, but if you could press that one button and deal massive damage, see a big number, you get that little hit of dopamine, like that still feels good. So again, gotta let the man talk, although there's 11 seconds left in the video, so he might not mention it. But I would, if I was live with him, rather, if I was in his chat at this time, I would ask him, and maybe he's talked about this, but like, how much of that is this press a button, do all your abilities versus this sort of crap tutorial that he's talking about?
Not mine. That's how I feel as a new player, or how I think a very analytical new player would feel. But again, I know that I have a tendency to dive way too deeply into all of these things.
So yeah, Josh is a guy who has played more MMOs than I have, probably than most of us have, both in terms of number of hours, but also just number of MMOs he's played total. So when he says something, I tend to at least take notice, if not outright agree with. You always got to think about things for yourself. Wanted to quickly look at some of the things people are saying in the comments. Thanks to Josh deeply diving into video games. I now look at them differently. Happy for myself, but being, oh wow, this guy almost is. Wow, wait, is this me? Could be a double-edged sword. The best part of this, in chat saying that they put the stun ability after the one that benefits from enemy stun. That's exactly what you expect a new player who's a bit more familiar with. Okay, yeah. So kind of what I was saying. But it's still pulling one over. Stun is only 1.2 seconds. The GCD global cooldown is 1.8 seconds, so it's impossible to synergize two abilities. Yeah, I didn't know that. I mean, I don't know. GCDs are going to be different for every game, but I would have assumed that he would have been able to stun and then, combo off of that. MMOs need to hire Josh consult. I mean, he might actually do some consulting for all we know. He might not be able to talk about it, but he might have mentioned it in the past. Guild Wars 2 has the little racial introductory area where it explains the basic stuff. And then while you level to 30, it slowly unlocks power and explains them. First 30 levels of the game are just a tutorial, but you don't notice because, yeah. So basically what we were saying, I get why developers don't spend much time on it because it feels like a throwaway component of the game, and that's a shame because it's not. It's, in fact, the very first impression that most people are going to have. So it's got to be tough as a developer to balance between an aspect of the game, especially in an MMOs. It's sadly, or not sadly, call it what you want, but the end game tends to be the quote real content. There's very few games, MMOs, there where leveling is considered most of the content. It would be good to get back to a place where it was, which was probably mid 2000s, and certainly before that, it seemed like it. The recent iterations of classic World of Warcraft hardcore, where if you die once, your character is dead, definitely makes that. Definitely makes leveling far more of the actual content of the game because people, like I said, you die once, your character is effectively deleted. So everyone is far more careful on leveling. There will be more people raiding, certainly, as more and more people get up to max level. But one raid wipe that kills everybody, all of a sudden you've lost combined literally thousands of hours of playtime across all the characters that die. So again, it's definitely difficult for the developers to decide how much time are they going to put into a tutorial. Are we just going to seamlessly integrate this, or are we just going to quickly get it over with and tell the players what their abilities are or not, and just sort of leave them to figure it out? The latter is probably the worst way to do it. Even if you're just doing a quick tutorial in the beginning, simply just saying, here's a couple abilities, figure it out. But yeah, anyway, I will link Josh Strife's channel in the original video. And yeah, I'll try to search up that other video I was talking about from, again, I believe it was Game Developers Toolkit on tutorials themselves. So thanks for stopping by. If you made it all the way through, really appreciate it. Drop a like and a comment about any feedback you have around either the content I do or things like audio quality. I'm now 2-3 weeks into content creation itself. So any feedback is very helpful and much appreciated. Thanks. Have a good one.